Tuesday, June 6, 1944, 06:02 in the morning. The English Channel, that treacherous, ice-cold strip of water separating the coasts of Great Britain and France, was, in that uncertain hour, the stage for a military concentration unprecedented in the history of mankind. The air did not smell of sea salt. It smelled of burnt motor oil, wet gunpowder, and the metallic tension of fear. The darkness of the night slowly dissolved, not before the light of dawn, but before the red and yellow glow of incessant naval artillery flashes, the thundering presage of Operation Overlord. On land, in the Omaha Beach sector, the German defense was holding on for dear life. This crescent-shaped stretch of the Norman coast was a cruel, natural fortification. Flanked by limestone cliffs and overlooked by dunes and embankments, it offered a perfect field of fire over the landing zone. There, atop a 50-meter-high promontory, stood Widerstandsnest 62, WN 62, a small complex of reinforced concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and dug-in positions that formed the last line of containment. Inside one of these fortifications, known as the Tobruk, was Grenadier Heinrich Severloh. At 21, he was nothing more than a forcibly conscripted boy, torn from his peasant life in Lower Saxony and thrown into the vortex of the global conflict. Severloh had not asked for this war, nor did he feel the ideological fever of the SS men. But there he was, clad in his greenish-grey uniform, with the responsibility of being the most crucial point of the defense in his sector. His world had been reduced to a small embrasure, a narrow, rectangular window carved into the thick concrete of the bunker. Through it, he could see the growing silhouette of the Allied fleet, thousands of black dots, gigantic warships, assault landing craft. It was a blood-chilling sight, a relentless mass of steel, moving with the determination of manifest destiny. The night had been an agony of bombardments. The guns of the Allied ships had been roaring for hours, trying to soften the coastal defenses. But the naval fire was, to a large extent, useless. Due to targeting errors or the fog that hampered visibility, a large part of the shells had impacted too far, in the rear, or had passed over the entrenched resistance nests. Severloh and his comrades at WN 62, under the command of Lieutenant Fröking, had resisted the shaking, the deafening din, and now realized the chilling truth: the key defenses, their machine guns, their firing positions, were intact and ready. The atmosphere inside the bunker was a mixture of terror and mechanical focus. The ammunition supplies were piled at Severloh's feet, thousands of 7.92mm cartridges in belts ready to be fed into his main weapon, the dreaded MG-42. It was a weapon of simple design but terminal efficiency, conceived for speed. Its rate of fire was so high, between 900 and 1,200 rounds per minute, that to the human ear, the sound of the projectiles exiting merged into a constant screech, a high-pitched buzz that had already earned its infamous nickname among the Allies, the Hitler's buzzsaw. The clock advanced relentlessly toward H-hour. Through the embrasure, Severloh could finally make out the fragile silhouettes of the assault craft, the Higgins boats. They were heading straight for the shore, carrying men who still ignored the fate that awaited them on that curve of sand. Severloh took a deep breath. His training, a brutal process of depersonalization in which he had been taught to view the enemy as an obstacle and not as a human being, took over. All that remained was obedience, discipline, and the visceral need to survive. The defense of Europe had been reduced to the marksmanship and resistance of a handful of men in that concrete nest. 6:35 in the morning. The moment arrived. Lieutenant Fröking, his voice barely audible above the roar of the sea and the still thundering artillery, gave the order to open fire. Severloh pushed the ammunition belt into the breech of the MG-42. His hand closed on the trigger. He did not hesitate. The air instantly filled with the roar of the machine gun, a sound that was a genuine howl of mechanical fury. The first, sustained and brutal burst went directly to the waterline. The fate of thousands of young Americans was decided in the first 5 minutes of concentrated fire from WN-62. The troops of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, laden with more than 30 kilos of equipment, emerged from the assault craft with the hope of surprise and the confidence of prior annihilation by naval artillery. But they were met by a wall of lead. Severloh's position was so advantageous that it turned the beach into a firing range. Fire was directed at the points of greatest vulnerability: the open ramp of the landing craft just as the men disembarked, or the exposed sandy areas where they tried to run toward the cliffs. The key targets were those who could organize a response: officers with their binoculars and field radios, engineers carrying demolition charges to blow up obstacles. By taking down these men first, the infantry fell into panic and disorganization, becoming paralyzed. The volume of fire that Severloh unleashed was unimaginable. The MG-42 devoured ammunition belts with industrial voracity. The barrel heated up at an alarming rate, and Corporal Krochka, his assistant, worked feverishly, alternating between the red-hot barrel and the spare one. It was an infernal routine: fire, change barrel, reload, fire. The sand in front of Severloh's embrasure became a quagmire of blood and steel. The waves of American soldiers, who were supposed to advance, found themselves immobile, pinned to the sand by fear and the bodies of their fallen comrades. The sea near the shore was no longer greenish-blue. It had turned a dark, murky color, churned up by floating bodies and earth disturbed by impacts. Severloh fired at the moving silhouettes, focusing on the eastern sector of Omaha, precisely where the defenses were strongest. As the assault craft withdrew and the soldiers scattered, seeking any kind of cover, the effectiveness of the MG-42 in burst fire diminished. It was then that Severloh demonstrated his coolness and skill. Corporal Krochka took over the MG-42 to continue the containment fire, while Severloh took his Kar-98K rifle. The Kar-98K, slower bolt action and equipped with a telescopic sight, transformed him into a sniper. Now he no longer fired at the area. He chose specific targets. He aimed at men hiding uselessly behind steel obstacles or those trying to coordinate an advance from the bottom of the embankments. The sound of the Kar-98K, a dry, solitary crack amidst the general roar, was that of individualized death sentences. Every bullet counted, and every casualty was a small but significant triumph in a battle that, on the macro scale, was already lost. But Severloh couldn't know it. He only saw his small sector, his beach, and the men who kept coming. His duty was to prevent them from passing. The hours dragged on with the agonizing slowness of an endless clock. It is estimated that in a period of 9 hours, Severloh had expended the ammunition assigned to an entire company for a day of combat, more than 12,000 MG-42 cartridges and about 400 Kar-98K rounds. The heat inside the bunker was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt metal. But the MG-42, although its barrels were worn out from use, kept functioning, a testament to its engineering and the physical endurance of its operator. The morning sun rose in the sky, but on the beach there was no light, only the shadow cast by death. Severloh, engrossed in his task, did not have a complete view of the carnage he had caused. He only knew that they kept coming, and he kept shooting. His later estimate of having caused over 1,000 casualties was an attempt to quantify the nightmare he had lived and perpetrated. At that point on the Omaha coast, Severloh was the embodiment of fear, the mechanical and human beast that had turned the beach into a cemetery. The following is the exact translation of the text into English. Time had ceased to be a measurable flow for Severloh and had become a physical experience of pain and thunder. The hours that followed mid-morning brought no relief, but a change in the nature of the horror. While the first waves had been massacred, the American troops had learned. The survivors had managed to find shelter digging into the sand with their helmets or crawling to the precarious protection offered by the embankments at the back of the beach. The offensive had not stopped. It had simply mutated, transforming into a war of attrition and slow movements as the Allied infantry troops managed to overcome the traps and barbed wire in other, less defended sectors of Omaha. The danger to WN-62 no longer came only from the sand, but from the sea. The American Navy, dismayed by the unacceptable number of casualties and the stagnation of the offensive, made a bold and desperate decision. They ordered their destroyers to approach the coast as closely as possible. These ships, designed for naval combat and anti-aircraft defense, risked everything, navigating into water so shallow that they risked running aground. When the destroyers closed in, the hell was amplified. The 4- and 5-inch guns of these ships began firing at close range against the German defensive positions. The WN-62 bunker, which had been a fortress against infantry, was no match for the naval shells. The air filled with the dull, powerful sound of direct explosions. Each impact shook the fortification with unprecedented violence. The concrete cracked, fragments of rock and debris flew inside, and suffocating smoke filtered through the embrasures. In the midst of this new and terrifying bombardment, Severloh's effectiveness was reduced. Firing had become an intermittent act, interrupted by the need to duck and take cover from the debris. Lieutenant Fröking, the position's commander, began shouting orders that could barely be heard above the din. The message was clear. The position was untenable. They had fought to the end, having exhausted almost all the ammunition for their main machine gun. But now the sea was defeating the land. Around 12 Setasa noon, after about 6.5 hours of uninterrupted, insane combat, Fröking made the final decision: retreat. The order was to abandon the WN-62 bunker and trenches, attempting to link up with the German reserve troops who were supposed to be in the rear. Severloh and his few surviving comrades gathered the essentials: their rifles, some grenades, and the hope of escaping the death trap. The exit from the bunker was a sensory shock. From the relative safety of the concrete, they moved into a chaotic open field, a lunar landscape of craters, fire, and death. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, excrement, burnt gunpowder, and the acrid smell of explosives. Severloh, along with Lieutenant Fröking and other soldiers, tried to move quickly through the hedgerows and fields, heading toward the village of Colville. But the danger had not ended. It had only changed shape. American soldiers had already managed to outflank the coastal positions and were advancing inland. The German retreat turned into a desperate race for survival. It was in this chaotic flight that Lieutenant Fröking's fate was sealed. A shot, it is unclear if from a sniper or a stray burst, hit him. He fell dead, leaving Severloh alone, a soldier without a superior officer, burdened with the certainty of his line's collapse and the invisible weight of the hundreds of lives he had ended that morning. Severloh continued his escape, crawling, running, hiding, until night fell over Normandy. The night of June 6, 1944, was a period of terror and disorientation for Severloh. He found himself alone, unaware of where his lines or those of his enemy were. Huddled in the dense bokages, the high, ancient hedgerows that characterized the Norman countryside, and which, ironically, became the tomb of many Allied soldiers in the following weeks. But for Severloh, the bokages only delayed the inevitable. In the early morning of June 7th, exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, Severloh was intercepted by an American patrol near the village of Colleville. There was no resistance. The young grenadier, whose machine gun had caused a hell of casualties in the most difficult Allied sector, surrendered. The man the press would later call the Beast of Omaha was not captured in a heroic act, but in a moment of total exhaustion, stripped of his fearsome weapon and turned into just another prisoner of war, whose name and deed were still unknown to his captors. D-Day had ended for Heinrich Severloh. The man who had fired Hitler's buzzsaw thousands of times was now preparing for a new phase of the war, life in captivity. But the impact of his actions, the trail of death left by his MG-42 on the sand of Omaha Beach, would transcend the boundaries of war and memory, forging a macabre legend that would only be revealed decades later. Heinrich Severloh's transatlantic voyage was a brutal contrast to the hours of hell he had just endured. He traveled as a prisoner of war, locked in the holds of a transport that ironically was sailing back to the country whose soldiers he had decimated. This journey was the first crack in the psychological armor Severloh had built during D-Day. Away from the deafening noise of the MG-42 and the constant tension of survival, the monotony of the sea offered him too much time to think. The young grenadier, barely a boy, was not an ideological war criminal. He was a circumstantial victim of a military machine. The weight of his action, the certainty of having ended hundreds of lives from the relative safety of his bunker, must have settled like a glacial slab upon his conscience. In the Allied prisoner of war processing system, he was just a number. His name was recorded, his military affiliation noted, but the truth of his individual casualty count record at Omaha Beach was lost in the vastness of the lists. No one in the Allied bureaucracy had time to correlate this silent prisoner with the deadliest source of fire at WN-62. Severloh's destination was the southwestern United States. He was interned in prisoner-of-war camps, where, like many of his comrades, he was assigned to agricultural work. This was the second major shock of his war experience. Far from the ruins and propaganda of wartime Germany, he found himself immersed in the vast normality of rural America. He saw fertile fields, abundant harvests, and a civilian population living a life the Germans could only dream of. This silent experience, working on farms under a strange sun, violently contrasted with the distorted reality the Third Reich's propaganda had sold them. The manual labor, routine, and physical separation from the battlefront served as a brutal form of shock therapy. Severloh was a farmer at heart, and the rhythm of agricultural life, though monotonous, provided a structure that helped him repress the horror. During his years of captivity, the war ended. The regime that had conscripted him and orchestrated the conflict crumbled. In 1947, Heinrich Severloh was finally repatriated to a devastated West Germany. He returned home to a nation in physical and moral ruins, where the future was uncertain and the past was a swamp of collective guilt. He left behind America, the country of the soldiers he had massacred, to return to his homeland and begin the painful task of reconstruction. The return to civilian life was silent and laborious. Severloh dedicated himself to hard work, first on farms and then as a truck driver, relentlessly seeking anonymity. He married, started a family, and struggled to fit into the new normal of the Federal Republic of Germany. He became just another responsible, hard-working citizen. However, his silence became both his armor and his prison. The memory of that June 6, 1944, was not something he could share. How could he explain to his wife or children that he was the man who, by his own estimates, had killed over 1,000 people in a few hours? Post-war German society, like him, was immersed in a phase of collective repression. The priority was economic reconstruction and the establishment of a new identity. Talking about the atrocities of the front, the deaths inflicted, or the terror experienced, was taboo. This pact of silence allowed men like Severloh to bury their traumas, but the cost was emotional isolation. The memory of the relentless screech of the MG-42 and the silhouettes falling on the sand continued to haunt him in the solitude of his nights. For over 40 years, Severloh was the keeper of his own legend. The story of Omaha Beach's deadliest resistance nest was well known among historians, but the name of the man in the sights remained in the shadows. The secret of D-Day's greatest individual massacre accompanied him through the rebuilding of Germany, the Cold War, and the economic boom. The breaking of this silence, however, was not a sudden event, but the result of the pressure of history and his own need for catharsis. In the late 1980s, the historical perspective on World War II shifted. It was no longer just about generals and strategies. People sought human stories and the testimonies of common soldiers. This search, by both historians and veterans, slowly began to close the circle around the man from WN62. Severloh knew that the time for denial was over. His story no longer belonged only to him. The following is the exact translation of the text into English. Time is history's most relentless archivist. As the 1980s drew to a close, the generation that had fought in World War II began to feel the urgency of bearing witness. Allied and German veterans, now elderly men, felt the need to unburden themselves of the heavy knapsack of their experiences before it was too late. For Heinrich Severloh, this urgency was coupled with the growing public curiosity about the unresolved details of D-Day. The focus of historical investigation soon fell upon Omaha Beach, the bloodiest sector of the landing. The story of Widerstandsnest 62, WN62, was a historical anomaly, a defensive strongpoint held by second-line soldiers that had managed to inflict hundreds of casualties on American troops, despite the naval bombardment. Historians knew that a machine gun, operated by an exceptionally cool and tenacious gunner, had been the primary executioner. Only the name was missing. Severloh could no longer hide. The pressure of history and the weight of his own conscience led him to make a momentous decision. Rather than wait for the truth to be exhumed, he would reveal it himself. In 1988, he published his memoirs under the austere and precise title WN62, Memories of Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The book was not a piece of revisionist propaganda or a justification. It was a raw, honest testimony from an ordinary man caught in the tide. Severloh recounted the terror of the shelling, the order to fire, the mechanical operation of the MG-42, and most importantly, his personal count of the massacre. The number he recorded in those pages was astonishing. He estimated that his machine gun and his Kar-98K rifle had caused the deaths of over 1,000 American soldiers in the course of those 6.5 hours. The figure, though subject to historical debate, most experts reduce it to a minimum of 300 to 500 confirmed casualties, had the effect of an artillery shell in public discussion. Overnight, Heinrich Severloh went from being a retired truck driver to becoming the face of D-Day's deadliest German resistance. The reaction from the press, both in Germany and abroad, was immediate and sensationalist. Severloh was given the epithet he despised, Die Bestie von Omaha, the Beast of Omaha. This nickname, intended to simplify a human tragedy into a chilling headline, clung to his identity. The press painted him as a relentless executioner, conveniently forgetting the context. A young recruit following orders under fire. Interviews and public appearances multiplied, forcing Severloh to directly confront his past. In these appearances, the former soldier always seemed reserved and melancholic. He never boasted of his record. In fact, he expressed remorse. His account was always the same. Fear was the engine, and the MG-42 was simply the tool of a war that had dehumanized all participants. He was not shooting at men, but against the necessity of those men killing him first. The publication of WN62 had a profound effect beyond the headlines. It forced military historians to revisit the narrative of Omaha Beach. The story was not just one of Allied bravery, it was also one of the brutal effectiveness of a defense, and the confirmation that the 352nd Infantry Division had been far more tenacious than Allied planning had anticipated. Severloh's testimony, supported by the evidence of casualty reports in the sector, became a fundamental piece for understanding why Omaha was, and continues to be, bloody Omaha. However, the weight of the confession did not bring immediate peace. The unsolicited fame exposed him to criticism and judgment. Although Allied veterans understood the nature of war and survival, the general public struggled to assimilate the story of a man who, from a single position, could have inflicted such immense damage. The silence that had been his refuge was broken, leaving Severloh exposed and vulnerable to the moral confrontation of his actions. He knew that the publication of his memoirs was only the beginning. The definitive closure to his story could not come through ink and paper alone. He needed to face the people he had wounded, those who had survived his mechanical fury, to find the final and most important balm for his soul: forgiveness. And that transcendental encounter was about to occur, starting with an unexpected letter from America. The publication of WN62 in 1988, while bringing notoriety and a necessary historical corrective, left Heinrich Severloh spiritually unresolved. The media circus and the distasteful nickname of the Beast of Omaha only amplified his sense of guilt. He had confessed to the world, but he had not yet found absolution for himself. His story, however, was about to enter its most extraordinary phase, transitioning from a military chronicle to a profound human drama. The catalyst for this transformation was a letter that arrived from across the Atlantic. The sender was David Silver, a retired American Army chaplain and a veteran who had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Silver had been severely wounded during the assault, struck by machine gun fire as he struggled to cross the deadly stretch of sand. When he read Severloh's memoir detailing the relentless fire from WN62, Silver knew instantly that the German soldier was the source of the bullet that had nearly ended his life. Silver's motivation for reaching out was not vengeance or condemnation. It was a deep, spiritual need for understanding and closure. As a man of faith and a spiritual counselor, he sought to comprehend the humanity of the man behind the terrifying weapon. He wanted to know the person who had been his near executioner, the man who had been the most lethal force on the beach that day. The correspondence began cautiously, but soon deepened into an exchange of shared trauma. Severloh, who had spent decades bottling up the guilt of the massacre, found in Silver a surprisingly empathetic ear. Silver, for his part, found a willing and repentant listener, a man who desperately needed to be forgiven. The years they had spent living on opposite sides of the world, separated by the great ocean and the chasm of history, were bridged by their shared experience of that single, bloody morning. The relationship culminated in a face-to-face meeting in 2004. 60 years after the invasion, the former adversaries arranged to meet on the very soil that had defined their lives, Normandy. It was a journey of unimaginable emotional weight for both men. For Silver, it meant returning to the site of his near death. For Severloh, it meant physically confronting the scene of the atrocity he had committed. The meeting itself was intensely private and deeply moving. There were no cameras, no press, just two elderly men who had once been separated by a torrent of lead. They shook hands, a gesture that spanned 6 decades of silence and conflict. Severloh, struggling with the full weight of his past, offered Silver a simple but profound confession. "I shot at you, David, but I didn't hate you. I was just obeying orders." Silver's response provided the absolution Severloh craved. As a chaplain, Silver was uniquely positioned to offer a spiritual balm. He offered forgiveness, acknowledging that both of them had been victims of the same colossal military machine. This moment of reconciliation, the victim extending empathy to his aggressor, is perhaps the most powerful and redemptive chapter of Severloh's story. It underscored a crucial theme in the narrative of World War II, that the vast, impersonal scale of the conflict ultimately boils down to the actions and fates of individual men. To commemorate their bond and Severloh's repentance, the former German soldier presented Silver with a symbolic gift, a copy of his memoir and the ring he wore during the war. This was not a token of triumph, but a gesture of surrender to peace and an acknowledgement of the shared humanity that war had sought to extinguish. Severloh's greatest victory was not the defensive stand he made at WN62, but the emotional breakthrough he achieved with David Silver. It was the final and most meaningful act of a soldier's long journey home. The reconciliation with David Silver marked the definitive conclusion of the war for Heinrich Severloh. He had faced his ghosts, both the internal terror of his actions and the external judgment of the world, and through the grace of a former enemy, he had found a measure of peace. The media continued to occasionally invoke the grim epithet, the Beast of Omaha, but for Severloh himself, the name had lost its sting. He was now an historical witness, one of the last living testaments to the sheer brutality of the infantry engagement on D-Day. In the years following his public confession and the meeting with Silver, Severloh dedicated himself to ensuring that his story served as a cautionary tale. He participated in several documentaries and gave interviews, always with the same solemn tone, emphasizing that his account was not intended to glorify combat, but to reveal its horrifying, dehumanizing mechanics. His constant message was that the war machine transforms individuals into instruments of destruction, regardless of their personal convictions. The MG-42 was simply a tool, and he, a mere hand on the trigger. Severloh's memoirs, UN-62, became an indispensable primary source for historians studying Omaha Beach. His detailed recollections of the terrain, the timing of the waves, and the effectiveness of the German fire corrected numerous inaccuracies in early Allied accounts. The sheer, documented volume of ammunition he fired, over 12,000 rounds, remains an unparalleled individual feat of sustained combat in the European theater. While the estimated death toll remained a matter of debate, his presence ensured that the sacrifices of the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were viewed through the harsh, unromantic lens of an opponent's perspective. He authenticated the hellish description of Omaha as the Bloody Omaha. His final years were spent in relative tranquility back in his native Germany. He was no longer running from the past, but living alongside it. His transformation from the silent, burdened former soldier to a public historian of conscience was complete. He served as a living example that reconciliation was possible, not just between nations, but between the individuals whose lives were tragically intertwined by the conflict. The handshake with David Silver was often cited as one of the most poignant moments in the long history of post-war atonement. Heinrich Severloh passed away on January 14, 2006. At the age of 82, his death closed the final chapter on one of the most uniquely controversial individual stories of World War II. He was buried in the land he had fought for, but his legacy extended far beyond the German borders. Settled in the historical record of Normandy, the definitive assessment of Severloh is not that of a beast, but of a competent, disciplined soldier placed in a perfect defensive position on a morning of catastrophic military miscalculation by the Allies. He represented the resilience and lethal effectiveness of the Wehrmacht infantry when properly dug in. His name remains intrinsically linked with the failure of the initial Allied bombardment to silence the defenses, and the tragic consequences that followed. His story, preserved in the historical archives in film, and in the powerful bond forged with David Silver, continues to serve as a vital counterpoint to the grand narratives of victory and defeat. It is a deeply personal chronicle of trauma, duty, and the ultimate search for forgiveness, a search that was successful only when he chose to break the silence and face the truth he had carried for over 60 years. The life of Heinrich Severloh, the granadier from the UN-62, is a powerful reminder that history is not merely a tally of strategic movements or casualties, but a mosaic of individual destinies, forever bound by the chilling, persistent sound of the MG-42 echoing across the fateful sands of Omaha Beach.